everyone, and welcome to Your Arlington Dollar. I am joined today by a very familiar face for Your Arlington Dollar viewers. Annie LaCourt is not only a former member of our, now we're going to call it Select Board, of our Select Board, and a longtime town meeting member, and just a person who has her finger on the pulse of things going on in town. But she's also was probably our single resident guru on this show, having been here right from the start. So Annie, always great to talk to you.
Great, thank you.
And we are going to talk about all things budget
Yes.
today. And specifically, we are we about to start the fiscal year 19 budget?
We are about to start the fiscal year 19
So
budget.
we're speaking in May
Yes.
of 2018, just to
Yes.
give people some perspective.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about where we are in the budget cycle, and I want to talk about fiscal year 19, what's in the budget, what might be new, what we're looking at going forward.
So we are at the end of fiscal 18. We have just gone through town meeting. We have just passed the fiscal 19 budget, and the fiscal 19 budget will come into effect on July 1st. And so the way that the budget cycle works is that that will then become the official budget starting on July 1st. And then, you know, everybody's got a couple of months in the summer where there's not a lot of budget going on, but the audits of the previous year are done to sort of see where we stand and you know, did we do proper accounting and all the stuff that you do in an audit. And then early in September, we begin the new budget process, which begins with capital planning, so with requests from the department for capital expenditures. And our rule of thumb about the capital budget is that the capital budget is, we cannot spend any more money on capital items than 5% of our operating budget. And that includes both direct capital investment, that is the purchase of things with ready cash money, and what's called the debt service, that is how much do we have to pay on debt we've taken on to do capital projects. And our capital planning committee does a very careful job of looking forward at what's the next 5 years of capital investment, and then what are we going to spend on that. So capital budgets get kind of constructed and dealt with in the fall. Depending on the year, there's a team of people, mostly town employees and the chair of the finance committee, who will begin to do revenue projections. What you're going to hear over the course of this year as we begin to talk about budgets leading up to the override request is a lot of talk about revenue-driven budgeting, and that's the kind of budgeting we do. We need to first know how much money we have before we can make decisions about how to spend it, because we can't make decisions about what we want to spend money on and then just go get that money. We don't operate that way.
Doesn't work that way, right?
Yeah. So revenue projections begin to get done, and that's about, you know, what do we think the new growth will be in our taxes based on construction? What is the projected increase in the levy limit? What does that do for us? The levy limit is the total amount of tax dollars we can collect on property taxes. What do we think things like motor vehicle excise and other sort of local receipts sources, what are those going to do for us? What grants are we applying for? What grants do we have that might get renewed? All that kind of stuff. And all that revenue kind of comes together in a big bucket, and then starting in January, all the departments will submit their departmental budgets, and all the other appointing authorities submit their budgets. The schools begin to construct their budget. And that all comes together by the end of January in a projected budget that the town manager needs to present balanced to the finance committee, and then the finance committee will meet with all of those various departments over the course of February and March and prepare to present a balanced, detailed budget to town meeting in April, and then we start the whole dance all over again. So that's our budget cycle.
Well done. That was great. Let me ask you, from your vantage point, again, as a longtime town meeting member, you have seen and approved many budgets already. Is there anything? It was a relatively short town meeting this year. I'm wondering if that means, among other things, that the budget itself is pretty straightforward. There's nothing particularly distinctive within the fiscal year 19 budget, or is that not the case?
This was a pretty standard budget. It was interesting because we actually spent the better part of a town meeting session, and town meeting sessions are 3 hours long, discussing items in the budget. And that's actually a pretty long budget examination for a town meeting. We don't actually make changes to the budget on town meeting floor. What we really do is for your town meeting representatives, they're allowed to ask all the questions they want to ask so that they understand well what decisions have been made and what those changes in the budget represent. You could make a change to the budget on town meeting floor, but the problem is the budget has to be balanced when you vote on it. So if you're going to propose that we spend more money on something, you need to also propose what you're going to cut. And most people don't like to do both halves of that, so you don't end up making changes on the floor. There were some personnel shifts, and there was some shifts in the way that we account for things that town meeting members, who are pretty precise folks, got right on top of. There were some positions, I want to say, in the rec department that had been accounted for under a grant and not seen in the budget before that were shifted, so that we're doing our accounting slightly different in that enterprise fund. And there were some other places where titles shifted, or a position ended and another one started, that the overall budget for departments didn't go up a whole lot, but there was some shift in personnel that made people kind of go, whoa, how did you discover $40,000 to pay for this year? Well, we did it because these other two positions shrank, or something along those lines. And that's a pretty typical budget for us. There was no, big outstanding item. A few years ago, we created a new department, and that was the facilities department, which is intended to maintain these buildings that we're building with all this capital investment. And I think that was probably the most exciting thing we've done in a budget in a long time. And it didn't increase the budget vastly, but it moved some people around and into this new department that's really focused on maintenance, which was something we'd wanted to do for a long, long time. And that is the answer to the question of, okay, we gave you this shiny new school, now what are you going to do to make sure we don't have to do it again soon? And the answer is a facilities department that's dedicated to making sure those things are well maintained.
Well, so your answer has led us right into, because you mentioned, what are you going to do with the shiny new building? You got to, now we have a department in place that's going to take care of that. And then secondarily, you were talking about, hey, there were no big, items necessarily. Well, we've got a big item coming up.
Yes,
obviously, we have been talking about it for some time, and that is the combination of debt exclusion for the high school rebuild and an override that is going to be necessary. I'm wondering, though, those are predicated on demographic changes in town that go back some years and might be extending forward some years. Can you talk to us a little bit, just again, as a perspective, somebody who pays attention to this and has been in a somewhat privileged position for understanding this? What are those demographic changes that have been taking place in town? I
think the biggest demographic shift is that we have a much younger population than we had 30 years ago. 30 years ago, only 15 to 17% of the households in town had kids in the public schools, and now it's over 20%. That's a big shift. We've seen a lot of housing stock in Arlington go from two families that were owner-occupied with parents living on the first floor and one of the kids or a cousin or whatever or some other relative living on the second floor to all those buildings having been turned into condos. And so they're each occupied by a homeowner, and each of those homeowners has kids. And we're seeing our property values go a little nuts, which also means that the folks who are moving into town are in sort of a different economic strata than those of us who moved in 30 years ago. So it makes for a really interesting dynamic. I think that we continue to see this, that where people's perspective is on taxes, town services, and their expectations is really dependent on their stage of life. When your kids are in school, your taxes going to more services in the schools it seems like a bargain. When you're a grandparent on a fixed income and your kids are in school in California, Arlington school spending can seem like disconnected from your own future. So, but I don't want to imply by that either of these groups is a monolith, right? I think that people would be surprised how people's perspective is on these things, and that although your needs demographically may be based on your age and your stage of life, often where your heart is or what your political position is on something is not dependent on that at all. It's completely a question of both your philosophy and your perspective.
Yeah, it's a good point, and actually acknowledging that they are not monoliths.
Yes.
It does seem nonetheless that there is, you described it as an interesting dynamic, but I'm wondering about potential tension between those portions of the town population who have either been here a long time or at a different stage of life, as you said, versus people who are just moving into town. Because you alluded to the fact that you said our housing prices are going a little crazy.
Yeah.
And I would say that that's an apt description in a lot of ways. It does mean that people are making real sacrifices, I think, to move to this town at this point, and that they really want that. This is the destination. This is they're aiming for this. So you've got that happening on the ingress side, and then you have folks who've been here a long time who are trying to figure out either how to meet their new bill, how to meet their new bills on fixed incomes, or just been here a long time and are availing themselves of a certain portion of the services in town. A vast majority of those services are irrelevant to them, perhaps. Do you have that sense that there is a tension or a potential real tension between those groups? And if so, how does that get reflected in the budget, or how can a certain approach to the budget address that?
Yeah, I'm not sure. It's interesting. I'm not sure tension is the right word. Okay. I don't want to set up a sort of a polarization dynamic around this. I think there are legitimate concerns on both sides, right? It can be very frustrating to a parent who's ambitious for their child to get a good education that the budget is so tight that certain things just aren't available, right? And it's so obvious to you that a little bit more in my tax bill will cover that, not just for my child, but for every child in the system. This is how we do things. It's communal. That's great. If you're on a fixed income, a $10 increase in your expenses in a month can seem like a big deal. And I think that the trick for those of us who are in decision-making positions, and as a town meeting member, I'm in a decision-making position, to remember that both constituencies, we need to have both empathy and concern for both sides of that coin, right? And so you can't solve one problem and not the other, okay? So you have to look for ways to help people on a fixed income meet their obligations or put off their obligations. And we have a variety of programs that are available for that. And I know the selectmen are working on more. We passed one of those at town meeting, which is an increase in the level of income that you can have to be eligible for a tax abatement, I believe. I'm sure Dan talked about this. And we have others that are under consideration. And we have some flexibility on all of those. So we have work-off programs. There's a state. What's a work-off program? A work-off program allows you to do some volunteer work to pay part of your tax bill. We either have or we're going to establish one. I can't remember because there was some talk about this at town meeting, and I don't remember which we did. We have increased the income limit that you need to be at in order to defer your taxes. The state gives you an abatement if your taxes are more than 10% of your gross income. The state will sort of pay you back for whatever you're over the 10%.
So an abatement is a form of rebate, you're saying, or?
So the best way to describe any of these things is to say that if you look at the total amount of revenue that you can collect, and what you say is, okay, we're not going to collect some of that revenue, all right? So let's leave aside the state program because it doesn't work quite like that. So we're not going to collect some of that revenue because we're going to either give somebody a break or we're going to defer collecting that until there's an estate to settle or whatever, okay? That becomes another expense in the budget. So you have to treat it as, sort of an investment in the community. And so the more income you have, the more of that kind of sacrifice of income you can make. You're covering your needs out of receipts from other taxpayers. So in essence, what we can do as a community through our taxes is carry our neighbors who otherwise would not be able to afford to stay here or afford to stay in the home that they raise their kids in and that they're living in now. One of the things I'm very cognizant of as the child of an elderly parent is how hard it is for somebody who has crossed a certain age level to actually move, how disruptive and actually how dangerous it is for them to move. So, if you're 85 years old, it's easy to say, oh, well, you could just downsize. But that's actually life-threatening for some folks. So that's not a way out of this. The way out of this is for us as a community to find ways to make staying in your own home affordable. And big picture, that's way more affordable for us as well, because oftentimes when you're moving out of the home that you've lived in for years and years and years, you're not moving to another house. You're moving to a nursing home or some other facility, and we're paying federal taxes to then support your livelihood. So it's bang for your buck for us to take care of this.
So let's dig into that a little bit more. What I hear you saying is that the percentage of our population or the portion of our population here in town for whom it's a real hardship to raise taxes even a little bit. There are multiple ways of providing some kind of help and support so that you're not forcing them out in a sense. That includes abatements and deferments, for instance. Deferments would be easier for all of us to take because basically what you're saying is whether it's next year, 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years from now, we'll defer your taxes until your estate sells your home, and then we'll take it at that point. So for all that time, you're not getting that money that you otherwise would get. Your solution, or not solution, but something that I think you mentioned would be, hey, if we have everybody else, those who are not in that position, paying more taxes, a little bit more, then we can kind of basically provide subsidies, so to speak.
We have more flexibility.
We have more flexibility.
So it's what I call shifting the frame of how you think about this, right? And I think that's what, I was very pleased to see that there were several articles in the special in town meeting this year that were dealing with this issue of what additional programming can we put in place to help out people who are going to be faced with real challenges when their taxes go up, should we pass these overrides. And I think that's the selectmen shifting that frame. That's the select board shifting that frame. Sorry, force of habit. Shifting that frame and also understanding that there's a real issue here that has to be looked at, right? There are a lot of constituencies in town, and when you are an elected official and you are looking at budgets and you are looking at providing services, you have to consider all of those constituencies and you have to understand all of them. So there's often this theory that overrides are about one particular group of people, but they're not. They're really about all the services that we provide to everybody. And are we able to continue to fund the level of service that you're receiving now? And are there services that we need to add? We certainly run a very lean operation. That's what revenue-based budgeting does for you. That is the beauty of, if you want to look at it that way, Prop 2.5, is that it forces you to revenue budget, and therefore it forces you to be as efficient and effective with dollars as possible. And that's not a liberal or conservative thing, that's just good government. And we have good government.
Yeah, so you were saying that when it comes to overrides, that's going to affect everybody. Services affect everybody. Fair enough. Debt exclusions on the other hand, are about specific projects.
Yes.
So what about the fact that the debt exclusion in this case, if we were getting some figures from Dan Dunn, who we spoke to at another time, and again, they're very approximate and all is still yet to be determined, et cetera, but the relation between the amount of money that is going to be, the amount of money by which taxes are going to be increased due to the override versus the debt exclusion looks to be almost 2 to 1 for debt exclusion under some scenarios, or at least 50% more of that money is going to the debt exclusion. He was talking about $700 of tax burden added to the average property tax. That is for a new high school. That seems to be a place where, I know for good reason you rejected the idea of tension, fair enough. But people will have different, the impact of that, or the what you're getting for the money that you're putting out for that is likely to feel different, isn't it?
I think it's likely to feel different, but in my experience, people understand why you need to finance and build a building. People understand why we need a new high school, right? It's been a long, long time since we did any work on that building at all. It's awkward and non-functional and not in great shape.
Right, and in fact, it's so bad that accreditation is that issue.
And that's the thing. We have no choice about whether or not to rebuild the high school. We have to do it. We have to do it because we need the accreditation, and because by law, we have to have a high school. We have to have a high school for our kids to go to. So the alternative to building the building and excluding the debt and being able to therefore increase our taxes to pay that debt back is for us to pay it out of the taxes that we're already receiving. And so what then you're talking about is a $700 times, however many households cut in everything else in the budget because we have to build the building. I suppose somebody could argue that it shouldn't be that way, but it is that way. It's one of the very, very few things that town government is required to provide, which is an education. So.
Right, so you're saying, I think, in this case, that there isn't much of a distinction between a debt exclusion and an override in this case, because just as the override deals with essential services that we all count on and that we all don't want to give up, in the same way, we really don't have any more choice with regard to the school, even though it is seen as a project for which you'd get a debt exclusion.
Right, and I think that the current high school serves as more than just a school for kids, right? It's also where community education is. It's also a place where the community comes together for various events and so on and so forth. And I think that the new high school will be even more functional as a community center. And I'm hoping that this sort of new vision that Matt Janger, who is just the most excellent principal on the planet, is putting forward will include bringing the community into that building more, and more interaction between young people and older people, and more community events. And it's going to be a much more navigable and pleasant place to be, and it's going to supercharge the education that our kids are getting.
I want to just return, at least briefly, to the fact that you have mentioned before about framing, how to frame this whole issue. I know that in the conversations that I've had with people, those conversations often begin with the idea that this is a bitter pill coming up, that the tax hit that we are all going to be subject to is bad news, and we need to justify it somehow, or we need to feel better about it, et cetera. I know that you see things a little bit differently than that. So explain how, in your opinion, we might reframe this in a way that makes more sense, perhaps.
Well, so maybe this is a time to introduce, my favorite document of all the documents that the town manager produces, which is the annual financial plan that he posts on the Arlington website. And that's a plan that goes through and in detail talks about every department, what they've accomplished in the last year, what their goals for the next year are, what their budget trend is, what their headcount trend is, and what their focus is, and includes an org chart for that department, and so on and so forth. And that's really a document that explains exactly what services you are getting for the money that you pay in taxes. And if you go and look at the visual budget, and all of these documents are attached to the same page of the website, which is the finance and budget page that you can get to from the homepage.
Okay, so we're talking about the Town of Arlington website.
Town of Arlington's website, and its finance and budget page, and there you'll find visual budget, an open checkbook, and the annual plan. If you go and look at those documents, what you will see is that for any one of the services that you're receiving, you are paying a lot less for that service as part of your taxes than you would if you had to hire a private company to provide it. So the question is, are those services important to you? So it's a clean and snow-plowed road in front of your house. It's the trash being picked up from the end of your driveway. It's knowing that there are public safety officers patrolling your streets. It's knowing that a firefighter or an EMT will show up if you have a crisis at your home. All of those things, that's what your tax dollars pay for. Now, there's a theory out there that says that government is an inefficient way to provide these services, but actually, for most of these services, government is the most efficient way to provide those services. And one of the things that revenue-based budgeting does for you is that it forces you to think really hard about whether or not you as the government are the best way to provide those services. So we cut out the things that are nice to haves, but say that a community group could provide, or that a citizen could provide for themselves. And we focus on the efficiency of the services that we are providing. Is the best way to provide this to have employees that we hire and pay, or is the best way to provide this service to outsource it to a company that does it well, and we use your tax dollars to pay for them, and then we bargain hard with them about the nature of the contract. So all our trash collection, for example, is outsourced, and we get to redo that contract every 3 to 5 years, and we get to bargain hard on what the rates are going to be, and to consider all the parameters of what that contract entails. Like, if we recycle more and there's a market for the recycling and the trash collector gets to keep the recycling, then can we get the total cost of trash collection down, which in fact we do. The same thing with composting and so on and so forth. So to me, taxes are a way to get more bang for your money. To me, your taxes are the price of, in high-flown terms, we talk about it being the price of civilization, and on some level that's true, but it's also the way we do things together as a community. And as I said before, it's also how we carry each other through hard times, okay? I've never had to have the fire department come to my house because of a medical emergency, okay? But I know that if I ever had a medical emergency, they would come, I know who they are, I know they're well-trained, and I know they're gonna take good care of me, or whichever family member I have. So it's like an insurance plan. And so those are the things that we do together as a community, as a government. Thinking of the government of the town as somehow not you and somehow hostile to you is the wrong way to approach this. We live in a democracy, and the government of the town is you. You get to vote for who runs it, and you get to ultimately, in this upcoming override and debt exclusion, vote for increasing the funds to continue to provide the services that you want. The citizens of Arlington have a lot of control over this part of their lives. But I do think people have got to go to the website and educate themselves about the details.
Well, those are fair points for sure. I do know that people would like to know or feel that if there is a way that the government is, that local government is responding to the fact that this is a big hit. It's a big ask of people. So what is the government promising, or what innovative approaches is the government maybe looking at, exploring, considering to try and, again, extend the money out a little bit further to protect people's pocketbooks in the same way as as they have occasionally to ask people to dig into those pocketbooks. And one idea that folks do mention is, hey, they think about the fact that animal control officer or something like that in one town or another, or a canine officer, if he or she is not available, then maybe they can, they go on vacation or something. Then the people in the next town in similar positions take over. That idea of sharing resources is also something that happens around the state in different places. Are you aware of, would you support the idea of exploring that kind of thing, for instance?
Oh, absolutely.
Sharing resources with, with surrounding towns.
We do, there's a portion of Christine Bongiorno's department that is a shared service, a part of health and, I don't know if it's inspections or it's somewhere in there. We have shared with Lexington and maybe Belmont. So shared with our neighboring communities. And then when I was on the Board of Selectmen, our previous governor sort of tasked his lieutenant governor with setting up a program to help communities build regionalization agreements around particular services, which was really great. And they also started a program where the state provides grant money to cities and towns for best practices and innovation. And the current governor has continued that program. And amongst the focuses of that program are regionalization efforts. And certainly Arlington avails itself of every opportunity that we have to consider regionalizing or sharing a service with our neighbors.
So you're saying we already do that,
yeah,
so there's not a lot.
We do that. There's this, the mindset of our current town manager and our select board and most of our department heads is to always be looking for ways to innovate, to always be looking for creating efficiencies and looking at different ways of doing things so that we streamline our operations. It's to their advantage to do it, and it's also a really important thing to be able to say to the voters when you go to them and ask them to increase your operating budget. I would never want to campaign for an operating override without knowing that I could point to every item in the budget and explain why it's there and explain what we're doing to keep the cost of it as low as possible. Okay. On the flip side of that, all right, I think one of the big worries that we have and the thing that we need to be concerned about is whether or not the salaries we're paying our employees are competitive so that we can always be hiring and retaining the best employees. It costs a lot of money to train someone. It costs a lot of money to send an officer to the academy. It costs a lot of money to train a firefighter. It costs a lot of money to have a young teacher come in and take a couple of years to get up to their full potential. And what you don't want is folks to come here and be here for 3 to 5 years and then turn over and go somewhere else because they can make more money. So, we need to be worrying about that.
And personnel costs are always a large percentage of
personnel costs are 80% of our budget. Mm-hmm. So I've probably done this, you've probably got me on tape doing this about 5 times, James, but let's just run it through one more time. 80% of our budget is personnel costs. That's insurance, salaries, pension benefits, et cetera, and 80% of our budget is public schools, public works, and public safety. So that's where all your money is going. And if we have to shrink our budget, we have to shrink public works, public safety, and public schools because there isn't enough money in the part of the budget that isn't public works, public safety, and public schools to shrink it to make up for any cutting we have to do. So
a very good point, and let's just reiterate it, even though, as you said, you've gotten
Done it
to
a million
make it
times.
various times, and that is, it's not just that that's where your money is going.
Right.
It's perhaps even more importantly, that's what would get cut.
Yes.
If there's less money.
Yes.
And clearly, I think that crystallizes things for people when they think about education, safety, et cetera. that, that makes it nice and concrete, I would imagine, for folks.
Yep.
All right, Annie, I would like to conclude by
Sure.
addressing the fact that most of what we've been talking about, or a lot of what we've been talking about, is a source of somewhat of doom and gloom for people, just, oh my God, prices just keep going up and I'm gonna be paying more in taxes, et cetera. But you've been in this town for 30 years and intimately involved with its operations. What do you say in response to that? I mean, what is the positive? What is the good that we can take from this situation that we find ourselves in with, a big tax hit coming up, for instance?
So I see us as the victims of our own success. That we have a community with rising property values, that people really want to be here. We have incredible amenities that we've managed to build over the 30 years that I've been here, like the bike path and the maintenance of our parks. We are attractive to young families. Those young families come in and increase the diversity of our community and keep us, healthy and energetic. We have a real focus in our planning department on economic development, which makes all of our little town centers, both the Heights and East Arlington and the center, very dynamic business districts. This is a great place to live. What I think is really important for people to focus on is that as a community, we have the means to take care of each other. We need to put the mechanisms in place, and we need to put programs in place, and we need to always be thinking about the needs of the whole community, not just one particular segment of the community, but the whole community. But we have the overall capacity to do all of this, and we have great staff in place in the town. I cannot overemphasize how smart and strategic our town manager is, and how that filters down to his department heads and what they focus on and what they look at, and how innovative our police chief is, for example, and our director of health and human services. How great it is to have somebody focused on facilities, the head of the facilities department, how much confidence I have in our fire chief. We have great services and a great town, and as a community, we can take care of ourselves.
That says it about as well as we need to.
There you go.
At this point. So thanking you for your time.
You're
as
welcome.
Always, we are appreciative as ever. I am James Millan. I have been talking to Annie LaCourt and will again at some time in the future, no doubt about it. This is your Arlington Dollar. Glad you could be here. Join us next time. Thanking you for your time.
You're
as
welcome.
Always, we are appreciative as ever. I am James Millan. I have been talking to Annie LaCourt and will again at some time in the future, no doubt about it. This is your Arlington Dollar. Glad you could be here. Join us next time.